Let me tell you how much I love Halo Infinite. I was at the end of mission 11 of 15 when I encountered a game-breaking bug that would force me to restart the entire campaign again. I actually had no idea what was going on as the game just wouldn't load my save. After doing a quick search, it became clear the save was obviously corrupted and there was no way for me to get back my 12 hours progress. Halo Infinite has an autosave without manual saves, and my save just wouldn't load. Apparently it had something to do with pressing the Let's Go play button for Xbox Live, combined with plugging and unplugging a third-party controller like a DualShock 4. Anyway, the options were to restart the game again, wait for a fix that might not actually come, or just abandon the game and move on to something else. But with Halo Infinite, the game had got its hooks into me, and the gameplay brought back memories of the fun of Halo on the original Xbox. The narrative was interesting enough that I wanted to see what happened in the end. So, here's my review after playing this game through almost twice, once on normal difficulty and another on easy just to get back to where I was. Remember, you can also watch my entire playthrough on my second channel, JimRPG2, so go and check that channel out. In this review, I'll be covering the game from the perspective of an original Halo and Halo 2 fan, and also somebody who doesn't play first-person shooters very much, because they generally give me motion sickness. I did play Halo 3, but the single-player campaign left me a little cold, so I didn't get around to finishing it, and after which I didn't really get back into the series. If I fumble on some of the lore, or you find my gameplay embarrassingly bad, I'd like you to at least know I had a total blast playing through Halo Infinite. I'll firstly go over the totally awesome gameplay design, open world and level structure, weapons and more, and then I'll move on to the story, graphics and art style, sound and music, and then lastly just touch on some improvements that could have made the game even better. I'll also briefly touch on the PC performance of this game, as there are some people who have been concerned about the performance. Also, there'll be gameplay spoilers up to level 10, which is about 2/3 of the game, so this review is pretty safe for people who haven't finished it, but still carries enough discussion for people who finished it to enjoy. I decided level 10 was a good point given Microsoft showed off level 8 anyway in last year's E3 Xbox Games Showcase.
Let me see. The Banished are using a modification of the Covenant's BattleNet protocol. Pretty easy to push through, and done. I've removed this location from their system. We're safe here.
LZ secure.
I didn't play the last few Halo titles like ODST, 4, Reach and 5. I always meant to get to 4 at least, but 5 I didn't have an Xbox One anyway. It wasn't that important on my radar since I heard slightly mixed reports after the series shift from Bungie to 343 Industries. I mentioned this because even though I didn't play those games, I really feel like Halo Infinite brings back the feel of the older games. It plays as it exists in our memories. I haven't gone back to play the older games, but I doubt they're actually this fast, smooth and action-packed. It's like somehow fans' expectations were going to be impossible to live up to, and yet the developers somehow succeeded by building the game in people's imaginations. That game where you're up 1,000 meters in the air flying a Banshee, dropping on some dudes to stealth them from behind, or blasting some shockwave bombs in a chain reaction to destroy a ton of bad guys. That was the Halo in people's imaginations, being able to try random stuff to see if it worked and having fun exploring the sandbox game mechanics. The feel of the game being something old Halo fans would love was what struck me from very early on. There was a lot of talk about Halo being open world, but it's actually what I would call semi-open world, in which it switches from linear level design to open world missions pretty seamlessly. The first couple of levels have levels very reminiscent of previous Halo games. Large areas chained together in a level either in an enemy base or spacecraft. In the third level it moves to open world, with very defined objectives as you move through the level, like power up this gravity lift or switch off this laser beam. Anytime you get lost, you can hit the down button on the D-pad and it'll highlight what you need to do in the game world. I found this very useful and less intrusive following a compass or mini-map all the time. You can use it if you want, or you can try and find the locations on your own.
It's close enough.
The semi-open world works incredibly well. The best thing about it is that it gives gamers a bit of a break and switches things up continuously. In a way, it's like how in my favorite game Yakuza 0 switches back and forth between two protagonists, always leaving the player wanting more. Here, the linear levels are large, beautiful, alien, and feel distinctly Halo. The early game has some of the most beautiful architecture the series has seen. These linear levels give a well-earned break from the open world areas, where those give a great sense of freedom and allows the user to do as they please and tackle missions in whatever order they want. But after a while, the amount of traversal can, just like any other open world game, get a bit tiresome, and the linear levels break up the open world missions rather nicely. There is fast travel, in case you're wondering. The open world also completes the vision of the early Halo games by having a variety of vehicles Master Chief can pilot all over it. The Banshee probably makes use of the open world the best, as it's fast and you can fly wherever you want in the open world. Mission 9 has you run around the map quite a bit, and using a Banshee here really makes light work of getting around. Overall, I really like the contrast between the linear levels and open world, and having both really makes me appreciate the strengths rather than the weaknesses of either design. That said, some of the typical problems I have with open worlds do rear their ugly heads. Specifically, traversal in open world games is mostly a chore, and Halo Infinite continues this trend, with Mission 8 and 9 its worst offender. In Mission 8, the game asks the player to destroy 3 anti-aircraft cannons, which are enemy bases guarded by loads of enemies at 3 different locations on the map. It's a bit repetitive having to do it twice, let alone 3 times, and travel to each location. Then, in Mission 9, the game asks the player to infiltrate 4 beacons at distances even further than in Mission 8. The gameplay in all 7 of these areas were all very similar to essentially just destroy everything at the base. I think they could have done so much more with the game design here and provide a deeper gameplay experience at each base, rather than pad things out on multiple bases. Moving on, what people will love most about Halo is of course the firefights and game mechanics, which feel very sandboxy, if that is even a word. The first great mechanic, which harkens back to the original games, is of course that it only allows the player to carry 2 weapons, a mechanic numerous other games have also implemented. It works great because it forces the player to try different combinations of weapons, and one of Halo Infinite's best features is that it has loads of weapons to choose from, and all of them feel very different to each other. There's 4 categories of energy, and they all have their weapons: kinetic or regular human infantry weapons, plasma, shock, and heatwave. There are fusion coils, which are these rectangular prisms filled with energy that you can pick up and throw at enemies or shoot them to blow them up. These are great, really powerful, and really fun to set off chain reactions blowing up multiple enemies. The game throws a large variety of enemies at you from the get-go, and most behave pretty much how they have in past games. Generally, it's enough variation for the average gamer like myself, so I think it's probably a little too easy for expert players even at higher difficulties. Once you familiarize yourself with enemies, most are just a matter of speed and marksmanship rather than any sort of outwitting or military tactics like outflanking enemies. The campaign in some ways is made exactly for me, someone who doesn't play very many first-person shooters but did play past Halo games. As I said, in terms of variety, it's pretty typical first-person shooter stuff, with your average little grunts, snipers, guys that run at you like American footballers, flying enemies, and tanks. On normal difficulty, you can melee a bunch of them before you and your shield become vulnerable, and if you can manage this carefully, you can just run around meleeing everyone. Tanks such as the Hunters require a bit more attention, and by the end of the game they got difficult enough that I had to use the power hammer to take them down. And enemies in vehicles require a different strategy. The best way is to hijack them and shoot at them once the enemy is out. It's also cool to hijack a Banshee and throw an elite into the abyss. Overall, it's mostly about managing the number of enemies and making sure you're not attacked on too many angles. The open world also allows Halo to expand its game design philosophy. Previously, levels were very much large battle arenas chained together into one cohesive level. In Halo Infinite, enemy bases called FOBs, or Forward Operating Bases, and keeps provide a really fun sandbox experience that fits in nicely with Halo's game design. Here, you can enter the base and tackle it however you wish. The bases and keeps also feel like they have a similar design feel to multiplayer maps. You can sneak around the edges to remain discreet, there are snipers waiting to pick you off on ledges, and lots of objects and buildings to use as cover. I was a little surprised that stealth has been mostly taken out of this game. You can't just sneak around and knock enemies out one by one. Most of the time they're too close to another enemy. Similarly, as soon as you fire one shot, the entire base is on alert. I like how most enemies in the vicinity will attack the player, and that can mean brutes, the ones that can run at the player, can all gang up and overwhelm you.
Incoming.
But what if it's a friend?
It isn't.
One old school thing I love are enemy bosses, and I find them a great way to end the level, though not every level has a boss. Unfortunately, it misses an opportunity here to develop any of the bosses in any meaningful way, including even the main antagonist Escharum. The problem narratively with Escharum is that he isn't given anything to do outside of explaining the motivations of the Banished, which is one of the groups fighting the humans, and most of it is just cliched B-movie nonsense. The other bosses fare way worse, often just turning up out of nowhere in the story to say a few lines before the boss fight. It would have been even more interesting if Escharum actually affected the story along the way, influenced events in the storyline, encountered the chief over the course of the story, and fought him at least more than once. The boss fights mechanically do an okay job for the most part. They do mostly what you've seen before, move faster, have more health, and have special abilities like flying or invisibility. One boss fight, Bacchus, was particularly difficult, but I think that helped to elevate the standard of my game a little. I've already talked about the weapons, but I haven't mentioned the special items and upgrades you can collect during the campaign, and I think that's important and something to plan out depending on your playstyle. There are 5 special items you can collect: a grapple hookshot, probably the best and most important item, armor, a threat sensor, temporary shield, and boost thrust. The grapple hookshot adds a lot to the open world, much like Zelda Breath of the Wild, and this makes climbing fun and easy and again expands upon the sandbox concept of the series. You can now sneak around and get to your favorite entry point. The grapple hook also knocks enemies back, grabs and stuns enemies while propelling you towards them for an easy melee, and even picks up weapons in the vicinity. During intense moments you can grapple around the stage to boost around. Definitely the most useful item. Adding upgrades to armor is pretty self-explanatory. You get additional defense. The threat sensor allows you to sense invisible enemies, the temporary shield lets you shoot but blocks all incoming attacks, and the boost thrust lets you boost in any direction in 2D. I'm mentioning this because if you rush through the game, you might miss Spartan Cores, which lets you upgrade your items, so just be mindful of that, though having completed the game, I'm gonna guess it can be completed without upgrading anything, though of course it would make it much harder. Having at least a 2-level upgrade to reduce cooldown on the grapple hook is very much advised, as bosses can be pretty fast. I want to quickly mention the difficulty for at least normal and easy modes. Even though I don't play very many first-person shooters, I do think normal was a bit easy, and I think first-person shooter fans will find it way too easy, and I think heroic would be a better challenge. In normal, the game is still very forgiving, and you can make a lot of mistakes and you won't be punished for it. For example, you can walk right up to the enemies many times and melee them while they take too long to react. Or you can forget to reload and are completely out in the open and don't get attacked. That said, some parts of normal are more of a challenge, particularly the last half of the game where I did end up dying more. Easy mode is interesting. I expected a real cakewalk for this, but it's actually not that easy, and it's probably going to be difficult for gamers new to first-person shooters. The enemies have a little less health and a little less attack strength, but they still retain the same tactics and aggression, meaning they still rush at you at the same speed. And just anecdotally, I played a level of heroic and it didn't seem that much harder, though this was just the first level.
Crushed, broken, beaten, useless!
Enough.
When? When is it enough, Chief? When we're in there? Because that's where I belong. In there. With them. Worthless junk. Not this. I'm not you!
Let's talk about the story and characters, and while the enemy scenes were largely disappointing and didn't move the overall plot very far, the one bright spot is that I enjoyed the scenes from Master Chief and the weapon. The weapon is essentially the new AI companion, which is a copy of Cortana for Master Chief. Somehow the unlikely super soldier and quirky computer AI hologram partnership continue to work in the Halo series. It's also interesting that Master Chief isn't that much more than your average good guy with good principles and yet is universally beloved. The writing is interesting in the way they portray the Chief. He doesn't say a lot, but doesn't mince his words if he does. A man who unconditionally puts humanity first, someone we'd like to have in our corner. The story, unfortunately, is actually really basic and doesn't consist much more of the Banished wanting to fire a Halo ring. Anybody after more Halo lore really has to go look up Wikipedia or read a Halo novel. It's just enough narrative that allows Master Chief to gallivant around the countryside for a bit before a final showdown with the remaining Banished. A lot has been said about the graphics in this game, and we'll tackle this in two portions, the technical aspects and the art style. During last year's Xbox Game Showcase, many gaming fans were disappointed in Halo Infinite's showing for a variety of reasons. Some of these being the gameplay didn't look all that exciting and the graphics weren't next generation enough. I do find it interesting that the final game came out quite similar to the Xbox Game Showcase if you go back and watch it, and that the reception to the game now is actually pretty good. To me, the graphics are close enough in both versions that there shouldn't be too much disparity in the reactions. Are the graphics terrible and last gen like people claim from last year? I don't think so. The game is beautiful, especially in the linear levels with large open areas with incredible alien architecture. The open world doesn't look as good as other open world games like Assassin's Creed, but I think we have to keep in mind this game still needs to run on Xbox One. There's no doubt a lot has been done to the game with the 1 year delay. What's there of the game feels really polished. As I already said, it's the art style and architecture that makes Halo feel really distinct, and it works well here. Obviously the last game I played was Halo 3, and given that was about 15 years ago, everything now looks amazing. At the time of playing Halo 3, I remember feeling the architecture and level design was a little uninspired, but here the artists have been able to increase the size and scale to give even more grandness to the levels. I know some people were concerned about performance of the game, particularly in the open areas. I'm playing on a PC with an i9-10900K CPU at stock settings and an RTX 3070. In the open world areas in 1440p on high settings, I was getting 55 to 60 FPS. Normally I'd like to play above 60, but I wasn't sure what to turn down to increase to a constant 60, so I just left it as it was fairly smooth in general. That said, the game does have areas of slowdown and stutters, but overall I didn't feel like they affected my enjoyment of the game. I definitely recommend playing the game now rather than waiting for devs to smooth out any rough areas of performance.
I will end you now! Here it comes! Time for you to
I'm not as picky when it comes to sound design and performance. Keen listeners might be able to pick out the flaws here, but it all sounds really good to me, and it's not like I know how a plasma rifle is going to sound anyway. Enemies all have the same cheesy lines they used to have in the past, the grunts still sound like children, and the brutes still sound like cultured Neanderthals. The 3D audio works well, especially for boss battles and when they use their invisibility. The music and Halo's theme is of course a large part of Halo, Xbox and Microsoft. It's as iconic as anything else in gaming since its release, and I struggle to think of too many that has had its impact. And Halo Infinite plays into this nostalgia and wonderful emotive track as much as it can. It's not constantly playing, but it gets used every couple of levels to remind you that you are playing the best Super Soldier series in gaming. More impressive is that the rest of the soundtrack is equally awesome and filled with tracks that fit the mood, whether it's walking alone on Zeta Halo or spraying bullets all around in a firefight. Finally, while I think this is a brilliant game, I do want to touch on some improvements that would have made the game even better. As I said before, all the repetitive stuff in game design has to go, but the same applies for level architecture. It's pretty clear that from about level 10 onwards, many of the same indoor areas have been copy and pasted from earlier levels. In the early game, it throws many new environments at you, from a large enemy mothership to an enemy base to deep underground structures. The game's levels are gorgeous. In the latter half of the game, while the story dictates that you have to enter another underground base or beacon, it would have been nice for a new environment. However, it's the same as we've seen before, and that's disappointing. It's most likely they ran out of time and budget. I'd also like to see more varied battle tactics and strategy in the gameplay. Many of the encounters were too similar throughout the game. The game got harder and threw more enemies at you, but you could use many of the same tactics like grapple hook and melee. One thing they could add would be more stats or a high score, which would add a lot of replayability to the campaign or single missions alone. Overall, to conclude, this is a great return to form for Halo, and it's regained my interest in the series. It reminds us why Master Chief was such an amazing character, and why sometimes just building fun gun mechanics and interesting enemies and battles can just be enough to make a great game. I think a lot of people will appreciate sometimes the best games have the most pure gameplay design, and I think we'll look back and see that Halo Infinite reignited the tide and cliched first-person shooter campaign. That's it from me for this one. I hope you enjoyed this review of Halo Infinite, and if you did, leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.